Hey guys, welcome to the show. Today, my guest is Jason D. Hill, and he wrote an article that came out a week ago that is fascinating. We'll link to it below. And the title of the article is "No, I Wasn't Born This Way." And it's very fascinating, very insightful. And Jason Hill is a professor of philosophy at DePaul University and a Shillman Journalism Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He has a book coming out soon called Letters to God from a Former Atheist. This is going to be a fascinating conversation, so stick around. Welcome, Jason Hill.
Thank you very much, Becket, for having me on your show.
Good to have you. So yeah, this article, "No, I Wasn't Born This Way," and the subtitle is, "And I Have Come Home at Last." So first of all, why did you write this article now?
Well, it coincided with my conversion. I was raised quite a religious child growing up in Jamaica, which is where I was born and raised. And then I decided, at some point that the idea of God didn't make sense. So I became an intransigent atheist for about 25 years, one of those evangelical atheists. And it just wasn't working for me. And I started praying to God to undo the atheism and realize that need was not belief. But I never gave up. I just started praying for grace and had a conversion experience and gave my life to the Lord about 4 years ago. And it so happened that this book, Letters to God from a Former Atheist, that is forthcoming. I had been trying to find a publisher for it for a long time, but I never felt that it was ready because it was written in a state of belief, agnosticism, back to atheism, trying to find belief, but not believing. And when I finally found a publisher, a very good publisher, I returned to Letters to God and I started writing more letters to God and prayers. And the idea of sharing with God, it sounds ridiculous, sharing with God my abuse, when God knew all along what happened. But I sort of confronted God with this thing that had happened to me when I was about 5 or 6 years old. And I felt a great unburdening of my soul in the presence of God as I was writing those letters to him. And I decided that shame and secrecy secrecy really is the root of shame. And so I decided I would write an article and really come out as a closeted Christian, because not many people know that I am now a Christian. And at the same time, I thought that, I started rethinking the whole phenomenon of this notion of being born gay and really thinking about my molestation, which I had never shared with anyone, not even my mother. She doesn't even know to this day. I had been in psychotherapy for 6 years, and I had never told my therapist about it. I had been in a relationship with someone for 14 years and never told that person about it. And but because it just organically came up in the letters to God, I began to think about possibly, various phenomena that could be causally traceable to something called a homosexual orientation. And I, under the guidance and under the tutelage of God, I began to piece together the relationships with my parents and this molestation that I think, in my case at least, if not caused, contributed greatly to my sexual orientation.
Yeah, and so how old were you when this molestation happened? Were you 5, I think?
5 going on 6, yes.
And then there was another. What was the other earliest memory you had? You had two early memories. And the molestation, by the way, was I think you said it was someone in your family,
It was a staff member. It was my grandfather had a huge estate. That was his retirement gift to himself, and he was like a big farm by the seaside, and there were lots of farm, we call them field hands, who worked there and in charge of the pigs and the goats and running the estate. And it was one of those boys, or men rather, who did it. So it was a staff member, and I sort of just I didn't block it from memory. I remembered it in detail, but I felt like I was not worthy of telling anyone about what
Hmm.
had happened because there was so much shame and secrecy. As I wrote in the article, 2 years later or a year and a half later, I put a plastic bag over my head because I was so desperately unhappy and traumatized by what had happened to me. And so subsequently, in the ensuing years, I just kept it out of my. I didn't repress it. I just trivialized the significance of it in my life.
It's interesting you say that because in my book I talk about that. I was molested as well. I think I was 8 or 9. I don't remember exactly, but and living as a gay man up until 15 years ago when I got saved and became a Christian, I never wanted that dark and terrible night to be associated with my sexuality. So I always
Yes.
dismissed it as, oh, that wasn't a big deal. And I actually was in therapy for 5 years. Before I was a Christian, I was in therapy, and I never once mentioned to my therapist that I was molested. Until I think it was like the last day of therapy. I said, "Oh, by the way, I was molested," and he just like gave me this look like, "Why haven't you told me this from the beginning?" But yeah, so I understand that, and I also was uh silent about it. I didn't, I confided in one friend of mine who was my age when I was a kid. I told him about it, but I didn't tell anyone else about it because of the stigma. I was worried about the stigma. If it got out, like people would see me differently, and my school classmates would see me, as some damaged goods. And so I understand that. So and then you talk about another thing, a second memory from your childhood.
That's the memory of my mom crying, and I think me sort of comforting her and putting my arms around her.
And why was she
And
crying?
um, well, my parents were living in New York at the time. We were what should have been a 3-year separation. They had migrated in 1968, and they were supposed to have been gone for 4 weeks. And my father developed schizophrenia, or was showing signs of schizophrenia, and it turned into a 4-year separation where we saw our parents twice a week, twice a year rather. So I think she was crying because she missed her children. We had gone up to New York to see her that Christmas, and to see the family, my father and my mother, that Christmas. And I think she was crying because she was terribly unhappy with my father, with the marriage.
Mm.
She didn't know it was schizophrenia. The pharmacology at the time, I think, was quite primitive in diagnosing or treating, if not diagnosing, treating schizophrenia. And I had the feeling after comforting her, and this is a pattern that developed afterwards, that I was the only person in the world who could bring her solace. I
Yes.
was the only person in the world who I was told later on by my grandmother and my mother that whenever I appeared in a room, life seemed as if it were about to break out into a musical, and nobody knew the sort of very sad, melancholic, somber, secretly depressed child that I was. But I put on this magical, upbeat persona to to sort of illuminate the lives of my mother and my grandmother, but primarily my mother. And embedded in my mind was the idea that if I left my mother in any emotional way, if I abstracted my life from her in an emotional way, that she would actually die.
Mm. I had the same experience. We have such
Wow.
similar experiences. Because my mother, I was the youngest of 8 kids, and my father was super busy. He was a lawyer. He was always busy and didn't really give my mother kind of the attention she needed or wanted. So that was my job. And I felt for my whole life, really, I felt like a surrogate husband to my mother. And I felt
Yes.
like it was my responsibility. Her well-being was my responsibility. And I
Yes.
felt that way up until she died in 2016. But so I know what that is like. And you talk about, we'll get to this in 1 second, but my father, again, my parents were great, as you know, they did the best they could. But my father, because I was the youngest of 8 kids, he had zero time to interact with me, to play with me, to hold me, uh, to say, I'm proud of you, I love you. Like, there was none of that from him. So I had like this kind of sort of non-relationship with my father, and then a very unhealthy, neurotic relationship with my mother. So I understand that. But your father suddenly repudiated you and your brother when you were 12 years old. Why did that come about?
Well, this was at the height, I think, of his schizophrenia taking its ascendancy in his life and really seizing his mind. Before, he had been extraordinarily close to me. We had a really amazing bond, but it was never sustained. I mean, after my parents' divorce, he'd be around for a couple of weeks and take us to the beach and take us to places where regular parents would take their children. And then he'd be gone for 5 months, and then he'd come back. Then he sort of had this, what he called a conversion experience. And he found that serving the Lord and being a parent, being a father to his children, we're not speaking financially, because he was never able to financially support us. My mother was an accountant in a bank, and so she was a single mother with 2 children. But he was not able to be a father in any way, because he said he had to be a father to the nation, and he had to be a father to the world, really, by spreading the gospel. And so this repudiation and this denouncement really came about because of an incompatibility that he found between being a parent and serving God. And so it was quite dramatic. I mean, he actually did genuflect. People think, I mean, this sounds like fiction, but he did get on his knee and said, I love you, but I love Christ more, and I can't be your father anymore. And he just disappeared. I never saw him again until I left Jamaica for the United States, which was when I was 20, in my 21st year. I went up to the mountains. His father had left him about a couple of acres of land in the mountains where he lives, and he still lives there. And I went up there to say goodbye to him. So for 5 years, I sort of cried almost every night, yearning for him and longing for him, waiting at the gate on a Saturday morning, just hoping that he would magically turn up. And he never did. He was quite serious that fatherhood for him, and still is, completely over, and was terminated by this vision that he got from God, that he couldn't serve the Lord and he couldn't be a father at the same time.
Wow. And so, and you say in the article, until now you believed you were born gay. What changed? How did that change?
Well, like I said, I began to look at that's the narrative that we're sort of sold by
The culture.
the culture. It's orthodox. It's received wisdom that all homosexuals are born that way. And I'm maybe not denying that there is a genetic component to it. I don't know. I suspect there might be. But I began, after I became a Christian, I began to look at the phenomena of my identity and the way my identity was forged in the crucibles of trauma, and a very, very close alliance with my mother, where I did feel like a surrogate partner, more than she doted on me, and she loved me tremendously, and I got a lot of affection from her, but it was more like an emotional partnership.
Yes.
It was more like I was taking care of her emotionally, and she would take care of me emotionally too when she could. She was very, very strained in her efforts because she was overworked and burdened by being a single mother and giving her 2 children. She sent us to the best private schools, the poshest schools you could find in the Caribbean. and at great expense. And so I began to question this notion of when I first felt sexual attraction. And I remember right after the molestation, which was 6, I, for the first time, had memories of feeling something for males, which is quite early, but I never acted on any of that until I was like in my 20s. I had girlfriends, I dated in high school, I dated later on, and had intimate relationships with women. But I started to just really question the narrative that I was really born that way. I really think that in my case, and I suspect in the case of a lot of gay men, that molestation, when you are sexualized at such an early age and you're objectified sexually, and your first entree into a sexual life happens at 5 or 6 by someone of the same sex, that your sensibilities, your sexual sensibilities, your sexual orientation is heavily influenced by that experience, coupled with the fact of a very, very loving father who loves you tremendously, shows physical love, and then retracts it, disappears from the world for 5 months, comes back, shows you that love again, and then leaves. So there's a sort of unpredictability in his behavior, coupled with a mother who is fragile but strong at the same time, and in whom I feel a deep loyalty and an alliance with. And I had the feeling that if I really loved another woman, this is very important, Becket, that if I did love another woman, it would be a betrayal of my mother.
Wow.
So I thought all these phenomena cannot be just cast aside. They have to have some sort of causal effect or efficacy vis-a-vis them and my sexual orientation.
Do you have an older brother?
I have a brother who's 11 months younger.
Okay. Because there's studies that have shown that if you have an older brother, that compounds it, because if you have an older brother and you're developing same-sex attraction or homosexual orientation, whatever you want to call it, the older brother, that relationship is always hostile. And that was in my situation, that was true. So I was just curious if you had an older brother. But so then how old were you? Because you were in a 14-year relationship with a man. When did that start?
But I was in a 5-year relationship with a man when I was in graduate school doing my PhD in philosophy, and that was a 4-year relationship. And then, so I was about 28 when that relationship started. And then I actually left him for someone that I just met at a conference. And I just, the minute I saw this person, I knew that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with them. I was about 32 at the time when I got my PhD, and we introduced ourselves to each other, and I went back to my partner at the time the next day and broke off the relationship, and decided that it was love at first sight, and I decided that this was going to be the person I was going to spend the rest of my life with. So I was about 32 at the time when that happened.
But you say in the article, you say 20 years ago, can you explain this? You say 20 years ago, you decided atheism was no longer an option. What did you mean by that?
I meant that, I had found romantic love. I had acquired, let's see, I've been a professor now for 27 years. So yes, I had my PhD. I've written 6 books. So I think my first book was out, and it was an academic book, a trade academic book, was doing well. I had a very good job. I had all the markings of a successful life. But there was this void, Becket. There was this sort of emptiness, this aching hollowness at the pit of my stomach that I could not explain. I could not have been more in love. I could not have had more friends. I was traveling all over Europe giving lectures. I mean, this is amazing, heady stuff for a young assistant professor who's published his first book and is going to like Europe 5 times a year to give these lectures. I was lecturing all over the States. I had contracted, gotten a contract for my second book, which was well underway. I had gotten a postdoc at Cornell University, guest professorships at Columbia University and other places. And I still felt this void. And I just realized one day, I knew intellectually that it would take God to fill that void. But when you have unplugged yourself from the source of your life, it's like when you plug your computer out of its socket, the computer is going to die if it's not recharged. I had plugged myself away from God, the life source, everyone's life source. And I had been living on that energy, that life source, and I was becoming depleted. And in my depletion, I realized that intellectually I had to find a way out of my atheism. So I remember going to Croatia and buying a crucifix this size and carrying it in my pocket. I remember engaging in certain rituals like saying the rosary, because I was raised Catholic, and still being an atheist, like going into churches and just find myself viscerally feeling emotional and lighting devotive candles while still being an atheist. These were all ways in which I was trying to somehow get beyond my own limited ability, because I knew that the intellect was not the way to God. I mean, I'm a philosopher. I've taught proofs for the existence of God and proofs against the existence of God and so on. I knew it would take something else. But I knew that this void and this sort of aching hollowness, in spite of all the accoutrements of success that I had acquired, was not going away. And something had to give. And something did give. I was granted grace. Because
I'm just laughing because our stories are so similar. It's
I know I read
crazy.
your book, and it did. I read your book when it first came out.
Oh, good, thank you. So yeah, so 2 years ago. Wait, no, how long ago? You had a rapturous conversion experience. Talk about that?
Well, it's funny. I was dating someone at the time and terribly unhappy with him, and loved him, but we were in this relationship for 3 years. He was what I could call a cultural Christian. And I was in Michigan with his family, and we went to church, and it was on Good Friday weekend. So we went to Good Friday Mass, and we went to Easter Sunday. And I'd heard this said before, but I'd always laughed at it. I'd heard preachers on television saying, on Easter Sunday, the tomb of the Buddha is empty, is filled with bones, has his bones because he's there, and the bones of Muhammad are there, but the bones of Christ are not there because he's risen. And I'd always just sort of like snickered, like whatever. And I heard this said again in church, and it's like a force from behind me just pushed me from the bench into the what is that little thing that you kneel on?
Yeah, the kneeler, I guess it's called.
The kneeler pushed me onto the kneeler, and I got zapped. I was like, I get it. And I said, okay, Lord, I'd always had a problem with the second Trinity, the divinity of Christ. God the Father, God the Holy Ghost, I could make sense of, but God the Son, I'd always struggled with. I just remember saying, okay, God the Son, I give my life to you. I don't really know you, but I've got a lifetime to discover you and to understand you. But this is my life. Take it and do with it as you will, and may your will in all matters prevail in my life and supersede my egoic desires. I said that right in the church, and
wow,
it's been a continuous adventure. I mean, I had tried converting to Judaism back in 2016 out of desperation, because I thought I have to find a way back to God. So maybe if I become a converted Jew, my grandmother's father was a Jew, and so I've got Jewish ancestry. I thought maybe if I become a converted Jew, it didn't work. I went through a year, and that just when they're about to sort of dunk you in, I said, no. My roots are in Christianity. So I was really desperate. to believe in God again. And so when that happened in 2019, my life just completely changed.
And you say that the gradually the attraction to men dissipated.
It feels that way to me, in the sense that I could never stand to be alone. I always had to be with someone. So as soon as, my 14-year relationship ended, I was back on the dating scene and was in relationships for like 2 years, and then that wouldn't work out. So I'd go into another one that would last a year. That wouldn't work out. Being alone, being abandoned were the worst things that could happen to me. Being single was the worst thing that could happen to me. And the reason I say that I feel that the attraction has dissipated somewhat is that I love being alone. I've been celibate and single for a couple of years now, and I enjoy my own company. I don't have that aching longing to be with a partner.
Yeah.
I go on the street, and before I would see people and I'd say, oh, that guy is pretty attractive. And now my friends tease me. They're like, don't you find anybody attractive? And I'm like, I do, in a sort of non-erotic sense, but I don't have that yearning to want to be with them or to forge something long term. I'm really working on my relationship with God, and what I do feel sometimes, like on the rare occasions when I feel like, is this really for me? Do I really want to be alone? I just find myself running to Christ, and I say, Christ, open your arms, because I'm coming and I'm going to run in there, and you're going to have to fill a void that's opening back up. And I just surrender myself to sort of rich prayer life. And before I know it, I have achieved a sense of equanimity and calmness and stillness, complete stillness again. And so in one sense, yes, I think that the attraction has sort of dissipated, because I don't have that burning desire and zeal and hunger that I had for a same-sex relationship that concomitantly would fulfill a void inside of me anymore.
Yeah, same with me, same thing. Before I was a Christian, whether I was in a relationship, when I was in a relationship, things seemed fine. I was happy. And then when I wasn't, it was like this constant, I've got to find the one. I've got to find the next one. I've got to find. It was always this urge to have a partner, and it was almost like, if I don't have a boyfriend or if I don't have a partner, my life has no purpose. And now, after being a Christian, after my conversion, I'm so happy to be single, and I'm so like, because my relationship with Christ is so powerful that I never feel that aching feeling. I never feel alone. I never feel like I need to go out and find, like, I feel contented with Christ.
And have there been moments when you felt like you would sort of lapse back into a desirous?
No, I've never longed to go back to Egypt, as I say. I've never wanted to be in a relationship with a man again. Like, that desire is completely gone.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah. So I'm so thankful for that, because it just like, God's, having that relationship with God and Christ is just so all encompassing. And I mean, I just have to go to his word or pray or listen to whatever worship music, and I just feel his presence, and that's plenty for me. So you talk about in this article, you kind of open the curtain and talk about what goes on in homosexual life, particularly with men, gay men, which is exactly my experience. You say that, first of all, gay men are very promiscuous. I was very promiscuous. And probably you say polyamory and promiscuity constitute gay culture. And committed or monogamous, quote unquote, committed or monogamous mean something entirely different from a heterosexual idea of that. So talk about that a little bit and kind of the statistics of gay men.
Well, you know, it's funny. I had never dated until I was in my 40s because I came out when I was 28 to my family, and then I went right off. And so in my 20s, I did not date men at all. Um, and so I went off to graduate school. I met someone at an orientation, and we immediately, within 4 days, were living with each other. And then in my 14-year relationship, as I said, we never dated. I just sort of locked eyes with this person and actually said to him, you are the embodiment of my ideal man, and we're going to spend our lives together. He thought I was a little bit crazy, but obviously we ended up spending almost 14 years together, and we never dated. So I never dated. And then I started dating in my 40s when this relationship ended in 2011, I think it was. And what I saw was quite horrifying. I was thrust upon a scene where I was in the gay world for the first time, and in the dating world on dating apps, and saw the sort of, I'm not going to mince words here, the pathology of gay life,
Yeah.
the dependence on drugs, crystal meth, cocaine, alcohol, the absolute disdain for any kind of spiritual, deep commitment to a spiritual life. I'm not saying that gay men are not spiritual. I'm saying that in the culture at large, there's a sort of superficiality and a shallowness that pervades, that terrified me. The cult of youth and beauty that are really quite idolatrous when retrospectively, when one looks back. And more importantly, looking at one of the reasons why I don't think any of my relationships worked out is because I was never really promiscuous. I dated a lot, but I only dated one person at a time, and in those relationships, I was always very monogamous. In my 14-year relationship, I was monogamous. But what was extremely clear to me was that I would say 98% of the men that I dated, always wanted open relationships. And all the people that I saw who were married had open relationships. I think I met only 2 people who claimed that they were monogamous. And, you know, another pathology that I saw existing in the gay count is the body count phenomenon. Like, the more men that you can claim that you've slept with, the greater there is to some claim to some sort of virility or masculinity that exists in the gay world. And I just started also to become very, very disenchanted. I felt like a fish out of water, really, that this is not the milieu in which I belong. Even before my conversion experience, as I was still trying to believe in God, I thought there's something deeply incompatible with being ensconced in this kind of lifestyle and this kind of culture and my search for God. And it brought me a great deal of anxiety because I started to feel like I was a freak. Like, I wanted nothing more than a monogamous relationship, and to be with one person and to spend my life with that person. And almost everyone I dated, with the exception of one person, seemed to want people who were 20 years their junior, or to have multiple relationships. And I also noticed that at the heart of gay culture was a sort of brokenness, that is the desire for intimacy, but at the same time, the inability to really cultivate and sustain intimacy, which requires making oneself truly vulnerable and truly communicating one's feelings instead of self-medicating on other men through sex. And I mean, maybe it has something to do with my training as a philosopher, but I think it has more to do with my temperament, and more importantly, having had years of psychotherapy, that this is sort of very off-putting to men when I would try to communicate my authentic feelings and make myself very vulnerable as a way of achieving intimacy, because it required some sort of reciprocal effort on their part. I noticed that this was a trend also that was a constitutive feature of gay culture. And I just thought, I don't belong here.
Yeah, you say in the article this. I'll just quote this. This was such a great observation. You say the endless series of hookups in gay life, hence the ubiquitous description in gay profiles, quote, looking to play, is arrested development. It is redolent of a child's endless indulgence in a world of romps. This is antithetical to the achievement of sustained love gay men claim to be looking for. I thought that was so powerful, because it's true. It's like this kind of Peter Pan syndrome in the gay world. And it's like your currency is your youth. And currency is youth and possibly, money or power in the gay world. And if you don't have at least one of those things, you're out of luck. And I've seen it happen over and over again in the gay world, and I talk about that in my book. It's, it was all when I was in 5 serious relationships, but it was always this kind of tension, because it was always walking on eggshells, because it's like, if I lost my career, or if my youth, or I got out of shape or whatever, then that person might leave me. There was no security at all in those relationships. It was constant anxiety, for me at least. And in all my relationships, I think except one, there was infidelity. And so I had a reason to be anxious. So yeah, I agree with you that it is this, as you say, arrested development.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. I think at some point, even the most brilliant of gay men, many of them are emotionally trapped in a sort of emotional state of around the age of, I would say, adolescence. They're emotional adolescents, even if they are cognitively advanced. And as I mentioned in the article, I really think that it's a sort of perverse way of looking for a surrogate parent in these hookups. It's not that there's something inherently perverted about most gay men. It's that the trauma that they have experienced from the loss of authentic intimacy with both parents, or one parent, I should say, that trauma has never been resolved, and it's a compulsion to repeat, as Freud would say. And in that compulsion to repeat the original trauma, you find an attempt to repair that narcissistic injury by seeking out endless partners whom you think will be the fix.
Yes.
And I think that's why, the promiscuity is such a constitutive part of gay culture, because it's like a drug. It's like the hunt is looking for the next high, and the next high has got to supersede and top the previous high. And it becomes what I call addictive sexual behavior, which I think the majority, and I've said this before, the majority of gay men, I think, coupled with these apps now that you have, like Grindr, and I've never been on Grindr, but many of these apps are cultivating addictive behaviors that already gay men had a predilection for, sexual promiscuity. So I think there are a lot of sexual addicts who are gay men, and one of the reasons I think they're addicts is because, well, I'm going to sound like a Christian here. Well, they don't have the Lord in their life, and they should. They should have God in their life. Many of them don't, and if they do, it's not strong enough, and they're not committed enough. But let's leave that aside for a moment. I just think that the pain and the humiliation and the suffering and the shame that were all characteristic of their development as children and as adolescents, that pain has never, ever been resolved. And so it's just a vicious cycle that continues in the form of self-medication.
Yeah, and you mentioned the stats in your article. 43% of gay men have 500 partners in their lifetime. 30% more than 1,000. 50% of gay male relationships begin as open relationships where men continue to have sex with other men on the side. So that, and I've observed that. I know that to be the case because I lived that life for 20 years. And you say, and I want to just ask you about this one quote from your article. You say the truth is that the rampant promiscuity in gay male culture transcends the human desire for novelty. Can you just tease that out a little bit?
Well, I think even in heterosexual relationships, men have a proclivity for novelty, for
Yes.
Getting bored and being stimulated by the visual, whereas women are sort of, I think, more sexually sophisticated than that. They are, speaking generally, not all women, because women are becoming more masculine and adopting many of
Like
them.
Sex in the City, the Sex in the
Yeah,
City women.
right. But I think that it goes beyond just a search for the new and the fresh. I think it's really a way of forgetting the past by piling on these new experiences that are forms of, again, deep self-medication that men involve themselves with, that transcend novelty. I mean, we all like novelty and being innovative in our lives in various ways. But what I've observed in gay culture is that there is an insatiability in the pursuit. And when I say transcends novelty, because at least with novelty, you can be sort of satisfied, or it can sustain you for a while. But I know lots of gay men who are on these apps who have sex with 3 men in a day, multiple partners in a week. That transcends novelty. That's real trauma that we're talking about. That is an addictive behavioral pattern that is seeking some sort of remedial pathway to suffering that seems to be intractable. And I don't think most gay men are really willing to talk about how that insatiable drive for constant sex is not just a pursuit of novelty and boredom, because one doesn't get bored with someone after a day or two, right? One sort of boredom might come within a couple of years or a couple of months, right? So when I said it transcends novelty, I mean this sort of maniacal insatiability that drives the sexual behaviors or sexual habits of gay men seems to me to be deeper than a search for novelty. It is a painful, tragic attempt to not just medicate, but to compensate for a lack, a void that was caused by some kind of parental disturbance in one's childhood.
Yeah, my a brilliant Christian psychologist told me that, I mean, and it's pretty obvious, but he told me that, what when when I was desiring men, what I was really desiring was m masculinity. I was
Hmm.
desiring the masculinity that I never got, the affirmation from my father, from his
Hmm.
masculinity. I never got that. So that's what I'm constantly seeking out, is this, this masculinity that I never felt. And so that, I think that is the core, at the core of that constant
Hmm.
cycle, is like you're constantly searching for, like, that you want masculinity, you want that void to be filled somehow, and so you're constantly feeding it.
It's true, and if you look at how boys, I mean, one of the reasons boys join fraternities when they get to college, or boys bond and move in packs when they're young, from which I was excluded, and I think a lot of gay men were excluded, but they move in packs, I think, largely because it's not women who initially, I think, reinforce the masculinity of men. It's other boys
Yeah.
who make the pronouncement that you really are a man. So you go through these rites of passage, I should say, that are quite cruel. You go through all sorts of um, tests that you have to pass, hazing tests. I don't
Hmm.
mean just being part of a fraternity. I just mean the cruelties that boys inflict upon each other, and you have to sort of tough it out. And finally, when you do so, you are pronounced a man who's now qualified to really pursue girls. But it's other men who stamp men with the imprimatur of of masculinity. And I think, coupled with two things here, coupled with the fact that a lot, not all, but the fact that a lot of gay men um, were probably not athletic, probably not part
Hmm.
of the jock crowd, didn't have that insignia um, um, stamped upon them, and also probably lacked as I said, I've never met a gay man who had a very deep bond with his father that was sustainable.
Yeah.
Coupled with those two phenomena, I think it speaks to the insatiability, the maniacal insatiability that drives the sexual behavior of so many gay men.
Yeah, I agree. And this is I wanted to get your input, or your comment on this. You say the unconscious political and empathetic motivations of progressive heterosexuals who support gay marriage stem from, I believe, a drive to legitimize, tame, and conquer the gay sexual imagination. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of progressives are for gay marriage, and a lot of my progressive friends, and I think a lot of progressives in general, um, labored and still labor under the idea that they were going to mainstream, normalize uh, the gay libido and make gay men into normal or ordinary
Right.
to tame men, to sort of tame the what I call the feral impulse that underlies so much of male sexual behavior. I think it underlies heterosexual male behavior, but I think when you get married and you have children, that it is tamed, it is
Yes.
tapered. There's a financial cost for straying. I mean, women are going to take you to court and clean you out, and you're going to be deprived of your children
Yeah.
most of the time. So heterosexual men, at least in the Western Hemisphere, they sort of taper their impulses. What incentivizes any gay man to sort of taper that impulse? Um, a dog that you might share, I don't know, a fish bowl with a couple of fish in there. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, it's like, kind of like, oh, let's affirm gay marriage so they can have a white picket fence and, live happily ever after. But they don't understand. They don't understand that that's not really what goes on behind the white picket fence.
That's why I say terminate the fantasy. I tell them just terminate the fantasy. It's not going to happen. It's
Yes.
not going to happen. In fact, what's going to happen is that the gay imaginary is going to become mainstreamed, and you're going to find a lot of women taking on, and a lot of people in general taking on, some of the pathologies of the gay imagination or the gay imaginary, and gay behaviors and gay sexual behaviors are going to become mainstream. So rather
Mm.
than you think people, liberals or progressives, thinking that uh, the institution of marriage is sort of going to normalize and tame the sexual impulse, I said there's no controlling of the sexual male imagination. And in a culture such as ours that now sort of normalizes homosexuality, mainstreams it, sort of encourages it in K through 12, in more ways than one, um, what we will find is that promiscuity, hookups, you see it among female college students, who speak openly about. I've been a professor now for 27 years. I've seen it. Speak openly about their hookups. You find that I am observing in society, Beckett, where women, more and more women, are behaving as if they had like a gay man trapped in a woman's body. You
Mm.
know, so I think the reverse has happened. That rather than taming the libidos and the impulses of gay men, that gay men have, and the culture in some sense has encouraged this, has unleashed their sensibilities, and those sensibilities have become normalized and mainstreamed, and you find more and more people behaving with the same kind of sexual predilections of gay men that heretofore would have been sort of frowned upon, but are now mainstream. You know, from
Yeah.
the various fetishes and kinks and so on that were in the private realm of gay life are now coin of the realm within the culture.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Yeah. And then you say in the article, so long as gays believe they are born that way, then there is no incentive to form a moral covenant with themselves to explore their brokenness and repressed trauma. I think that's true. I mean, if you just believe like this is the way I am born, and by the way, I talk about this all the time. I mean, it doesn't matter if the New York Times had a headline that said scientist discovers gay gene, I would say so what? Because of the fall, we're all corrupted, including our genetic coding is corrupted by the fall. So um but yeah, I think that's true. There's no desire to look at, your past trauma or whatever if you just, if you feel like, oh, I was born gay, or some people who would say God created me this way.
Exactly. And that goes outside of the realm of being gay. That's just a sort of narcissistic self-indulgence that you find happening in our culture, where people just say, look, this is the way I am, and like Coca-Cola, love it or leave it. And I don't want to change. It's not just gay, it's just like any kind of behavioral um, pattern or any kind of characteristic that forms the core of one's identity. One is very reluctant these days, and identity politics has given rise to this phenomenon. One is very reluctant to pin one's aspirational identity on the possibility of becoming something or someone better. One wants, I think a lot of people are just satisfied with remaining rooted within what I call their rottenness, their
Mm.
pathologies, because this is just how I am, whether it's being gay or whether it's being narcissistic or whether it's being, antisocial, or you name the characteristic that gets codified into an identity. People are less likely to subject themselves to some kind of revisionism and to pin their aspirational identity on becoming a different kind of person. It's what I call being morally ambitious. Moral ambition is dead in our culture. right?
Mhm.
People do not know what it is to be more ambitious, to strive to be a better person than the one that you find yourself inhabiting today.
It's quite the reverse.
It's quite the reverse.
It's like, how depraved can I be? How I want to be more depraved.
Yes, I want to be more depraved, and any model, aspirational model, which one could reasonably emulate, such as Christ, you find even within the LGBT community now is problematizing. I mean, we have this phenomenon of Bible queering. I was looking at the syllabi of various divinity schools. I just decided to just randomly pick just a ton of universities and look at the syllabi of their divinity schools, and it's like Bible querying and the LGBTQing of curricula are all coin of the realm, right? So
Mhm.
you have even pastors who, I'm trying to find a church, and one of the reasons I can't find a church is that every time I go into a church, it's woke as hell, though, and literally like as hell might be, because the pastor's talking about the great they, you know, when the Archbishop of the Church of England does not want to use the word create, um, uh, what he doesn't want to use the word. What is the word he doesn't want to use? That God is our. I think there's a word that he's uncomfortable with. He wants to use a sort of gender neutral term.
Okay, it's Justin Welby, right?
Yeah. This is really a corrupting influence, when in divinity schools, you have scholars who are going through the Bible looking to homosexualize not just Daniel, that gay said they suspected all along was gay, but
David
every
and
single.
David and Jonathan, yeah, yeah.
Yes, but even Christ himself,
Oh yeah.
and that this, who had, they say, had relations with his, must have had relations with his disciples. This is crazy. This is part of the pathology of the LGBTQ agenda, which is nihilistic. It's destructive. Its goal is to not just destroy values because they're values, but to destroy human lives that are absolutely dependent on these values for their sustenance. Um, and this is coming from the LGBTQ, um, and queer theorists in universities and colleges that do have a trickle down effect, and the trickle down effect is happening very, very, very quickly. So I raised the point of moral ambition is dead because the great icons that one could pin one's aspirational identity on, in terms of emulating some of those characteristics of those icons, themselves are being bastardized, are being demonized, are being queered, by the LGBT, let's just call it, not a community, but the LGBTQ agenda,
Hmm.
in our culture.
Yeah.
And it's quite dangerous. It's quite dangerous.
Yeah, and of course, obviously, it's infecting churches, churches that you would never imagine would fall for it. It's invading churches, and so nowhere nowhere is unaffected by this ideology.
No.
But let's end on a happy note. You say at the end of your article, you say the renunciation, and you mentioned this before a little bit, but you say the renunciation of my homosexuality and living a chaste life has brought me a peace and joy I could not have imagined. And I feel the same way.
I'm glad. Yeah. I, I mean,
So go
the
ahead.
constant striving and the constant aching and the constant searching for something that by its nature is ephemeral is
Yeah.
over. And
And go ahead.
there's just certain wisdom in realizing that it's like the snake eating its tail.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to devour your tail anymore. You're just going to move forward to the light.
And before we go, just will you mention again your book, the name of your book, and when it will be available?
Well, it's available on Amazon for pre-purchase, but it's my sixth book, and it's called Letters to God from a Former Atheist, and it'll be published in February. But people are already buying the book on Amazon, because it's up on Amazon for pre-publication sale. So
Okay, good. We'll link to that below as well. We'll link to the article and to the book below. But Jason Hill, I can't wait for the book, and you have to come back on the show to talk about the book. But thank you for coming on today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Becket. I've been a fan of yours for years.
Oh,
So when I read your Change of Affection, and so the fact that I'm here on your show is such an honor for me, and I'm very humbled by it.
thank you. Well, thank you guys for watching, and we will see you next time.